Has WoW become overly complicated? This is one thing that a lot of the classic Andes hate about retail WoW. They say the game's too complicated, too bloated, and it's one thing that slightly worries me about the hero specs that we're getting soon. With all the different specs on top of your specs and everything else. Is the game too bloated? Is it too complicated? Do we need a WoW 2 to reset everything? Let's watch this Mr. Marcellian video and check out what he has to say.
WoW is overly complex today, and it's keeping new players from coming into the game.
New players is the problem, definitely. That's the one that hurts the most, because anyone who tells me, hey, should I start playing WoW? I feel like I need to give them a manual to figure it out before they can start.
It's required too many weak auras and add-ons to help you react to mechanics. Classes need a degree in physics, experience in engineering, and the ability to stick a cylinder block into a square hole with your eyes closed, somebody else's hand, from 5 feet away without speaking the same language or being from the same planet. It gets a bit too much, and although for long-time players the added level of death is refreshing and challenging, sometimes it can be taken too far. So let's see where WoW went too far with the complexity. Yeah. Starting simple and where most people take their first step.
Before he starts, I will say one thing. Society has changed too. Okay, you got to remember that early vanilla WoW, it was more complex than we originally realized, but we sucked. We sucked at everything. We sucked at gaming. The internet was still, fairly new to the world of data mining and revealing secrets and parsing and all that stuff. Those things were still kind of new concepts at the time. So people didn't really max their gear out or know biz gear or understand necessarily how the best specs worked and everything else. We kind of just played the game. We just went in, blind as shit, not knowing what the hell was going on. Now, yes, the game has become more complicated, but at the same time, society has become more complicated when it comes to gaming. Like, there's all these guides and everything. This shit didn't exist before. Add-ons. All these things have added to the complexity for sure. But there's in-game and outside.
Leveling. For a new player, all I have to say is, good luck.
A good old purge.
You'll be shoved into Battle for Azeroth for some reason, which has no transition into the Dragonflight story whatsoever. To be fair, neither does Shadowlands, and this is a byproduct of the devs wanting to get rid of that storyline ASAP.
Yeah, I really think
this
was to kind of keep people away from Shadowlands. We're just gonna skip over this. This is the the redheaded stepchild expansion. We're not gonna deal with it.
New people to understand what the hell is going on, what is World of Warcraft, and what does leveling have to do with playing the new expansion. Since WoW has soon 20 years of story and expansions, it will be harder and harder to make them relevant, and leveling has stopped being relevant probably in the first expansion, when the game became all about the end game and max level. So long as end game starts at max level and all the actual content starts at max level, leveling will only be a means to an end, which doesn't help people that they acquire close to no benefit from leveling outside maybe the last 10 levels they do in Dragonflight that starts them with the reputations, professions, and world exploration, and even that is me being incredibly generous here. The best solution for this is something we already have, and that is Exile's Reach, the alternative to leveling that people can take on their second character onwards. If this mode can be made to take you from level 1 to 60, or whatever the new expansion's level start will be, while explaining to people what dungeons and raids are, how professions work, how forming groups and getting into guilds is, it can solve a lot of barriers of entry for new people.
It can, yeah, most definitely. I think Exile's Reach probably is the solution as he described here. Forming groups and getting into guilds, those things. The good thing is with the new NPC, dungeons that they have with the AI and all that, you can really teach people how to even understand how dungeons work, how different roles work in the game, healing versus DPS versus tanking. Exile's Reach would probably be the best way to do it, to introduce somebody to the game all the way up until the most current expansion, then have them play through that. And then they can always go back and do the old shit, but I agree, the story is so chopped up right now. Really, people don't understand what the hell's going on in terms of story. They would really have to watch a lot of pyro videos and then watch Samiccus react to those pyro videos. That would be the only way they can figure things out.
Barriers of entry for new people. The current gearing system is too complex for new and existing people as well. You have 6 total item types from Explorer to Adventurer, Veteran, Champion, Hero, and Myth, and all can be upgraded using currencies, which there are a total of 5 of. Both the currencies and the gear can be obtained from multiple sources.
Yeah, it's so good too. The way Blizzard does this shit. Even me as a veteran player, they name the currency something else different than the gear, and you have no idea what the fuck goes with what half the time. Like, why can't they just have Myth Track crests and Myth Track gear? Why does it have to be two different names? Aspect versus Drake versus I don't know, Nethercock crests, and then you got the other shit, and you got the Myth Track gear that is different than the heroic gear. You got to use certain crests certain ways and different at different item levels. It's confusing as shit. Even for people who've been playing this game for a long time, but Blizzard just loves to create more currencies, loves to add new shit into the game, and loves to create names for things that make no sense whatsoever.
Higher difficulty rewarding higher item level enabling rewards.
Because dragons, dude, yeah.
The issues start when a lot of this is gated, and it also overlaps to the point where you need a spreadsheet to keep track of it. We made a gearing video to get your alts to 480 item level, and the simplest advice we could give people is to just do plus 18s and bypass 90% of the gearing issues in terms of item types, currency types, and vault rewards. When that is the solution to your gearing system, ignoring the majority of the content, then we have a problem.
Yeah.
Why not just get rid of the item types entirely and leave currencies in charge of what eye levels you can upgrade? You can make it so only aspect crests get the items to the highest item level, and the aspect crests can only be looted from mythic raids and plus 18s or higher. That way, players don't need a subscription to Microsoft Office for their Excel portfolios when it comes to gearing.
I mean, look, really, Blizzard could have just had one crest system, one crest currency, and you just need more of it to upgrade higher. And more of it drops the higher difficulty you do. That would have been easy. You know what I'm saying? Like, to upgrade a Myth Track gear, you need 50 crests, right? And to upgrade Heroic, you need 30 crests. And when you're doing Heroic or Mythic, the bosses drop more crests the higher difficulty you're doing. But they had to create like a freaking arbitrary 5 different crest system. Why? I don't. And then flight stones on top of that. Jesus. It's like they intentionally make it complicated.
Good enough reason that I have to load the same item in 3 or more variations and use 3 or more different currencies from 2 to 3 drop locations to reach the end goal of getting the best gear I can. Item level, explorer, adventurer, veteran, champion, hero, myth, flight stones, whelp crest, drake crest, worm crest, aspect crest, and these enchanted for crafting professions, which I'm not even gonna touch.
Oh God.
Too much.
It's ridiculous.
Just too much, and it's not interesting. If you want to raid on heroic or mythic, better be prepared with a list of add-ons that can make the fights possible, or at least not a total pain in the ass for your group. This has been a back and forth topic for a while. People made weakars to make boss fights more efficient.
This has gotten better. Shadowlands was like peak add-on, the desire for add-ons were required. I mean, you guys remember the whole Among Us fight and everything with the Dreadlords? Man, it was horrible. If you didn't have the add-on, you were a dead weight, dead body for the raid. You could not do the fight. So they since then they have gotten better. I feel like now you don't need as much to do boss fights. You should still probably have some add-ons, but overall, they've kind of backtracked on some of that stuff.
And the devs made boss fights harder to challenge people using weakars, which in turn made more complex weakars to make the fights more efficient, turning future raid designs into even more complex 3D chess problem-solving minigames. Not sure who has to give here, but we got to a point where Mythic Niltarion was a fight that used the weakar to showcase the layout of the boss room you were in, where the walls were, and where you had to go depending on what mechanic was happening.
Okay, I mean, this is a bit overdone. Come on, did you really need this shit? I knew I was the one tanking this fight. Back in the day, it was not hard to figure out where the damn walls were and where you should go. Maybe in Mythic it required a bit more, so I might be speaking out of turn here, but Jesus, some people just are a bit much with their add-ons, I feel like.
When an add-on starts telling you how to play the game, we have a problem. Obviously, not everyone gets to clear end raid bosses like Mythic Niltarion, but this is an extreme example of how much of the fight is being played by colors and shapes on your screens, and how much by not you making decisions. Some people could likely play the fights without add-ons, but they would have to not play with their friends that cannot do the same. And sometimes even playing without add-ons or weakars becomes incredibly inefficient when you have to have reaction times to mechanics that cannot span more than a second long. That's not necessarily new to gaming, but I don't believe that's something that has a place in WoW. Sure, difficulty can exist, but there has to be a line you draw where that difficulty forces people to use add-ons and weak auras or not be able to engage with the content because they don't have.
Right. The main issue was Weak Aura started to create an arms race with Blizzard, where Blizzard knew the add-ons existed and they were trying to design more and more difficult fights, but the fights were becoming so difficult that the weak auras were necessary. Weak auras got better, the fights got harder, and it just continued to go back and forth. Eventually, Blizzard gave up. It was really at the end of Shadowlands where they said, we're going to stop designing fights and with the race to world first in mind and just try to design fights that are fun, good, and the right amount of difficulty. And I think they've achieved that. They've gotten very close to that with the last couple of raids we've gotten. Amir Drasil to me is a very good raid. Difficulty is just about on par with what I would expect it to be. Sepulchre, the first one, that was a shit show.
A 17-year-old. The
Still
difficulty in raiding was always mostly in getting all 20 or so people to do the same thing, even if it was a simple thing, and not as a big of a focus on individual skill level, which take us to the second big issue with raiding. Too many mechanics, mostly complex ones, put a lot of responsibility on a singular player, which more often than not becomes a do or die mechanic where if failed, the entire raid wipes.
Yeah.
That is not fun and definitely pushes using external help to be able to assign people to the mechanic and making sure it will be done properly.
Yeah, this is what Anduin's fight was famous for. Anduin basically had 3 or 4 mechanics that occurred 2 to 3 times during the fight, and if any of those 3 to 4 mechanics that were occurring 2 to 3 times were failed by a single person in the raid, the entire raid would wipe. Right? The entire raid would wipe. So basically, based on the math that I just told you, there were about 12 to 15 ish instances, 12 to 16, sorry, where the entire raid could wipe if one person done fucked it up. And that was never fun.
Fewer mechanics that target individual players.
And I'm talking about freaking heroic. Mythic was probably a completely different animal.
Which, if they die, wipe the rest of the raid. That severely limits new people getting into raiding and adds to the necessity of weak auras and other add-ons being used. Constant scaling content is fun, but added affixes that forces you to play a different game is not. And I'm talking about situations where you have to do your rotation for your class and then stop engaging with the pack or your party and then swap your attention to this other thing instead. Inherently, that's not really bad, but also not the reason I am here in the dungeon, I mean. If I am a DPS, I am there to kill monsters, not ruin my rotation synergy, dash across the room to handle this one thing that's an obstacle, then go back to what I was doing. If it's a dungeon mechanic, that's fine. But when you add affixes on top of those dungeon mechanics already, it stops being fun and becomes an extra layer of mechanics I need to handle. It's not about skill here. It's not hard to dispel an afflicted ghost. It's, however, annoying when I have to change my talent in a self-harming way to bring a utility that wasn't made naturally available to me by the Spec's design. And
I will say, though, I feel like affixes are in a better place, too. Overall, Dragonflight's been a good course correction. Yes, affixes for a while were becoming way too complicated. They were annoying as hell. They were creating instances where you essentially needed to bring certain classes into the group because if you didn't, the raid was going to wipe because the affix was so ridiculously overpowered. Those things were annoying. I feel like now the way they ramp it up with the affixes, right? You start with 0, then you get 1 eventually at I think plus 14 or 15. They start to stack on top of each other. And the affixes they're currently using are less annoying than previous ones. I think they've learned their lesson when it comes to affixes and how to really get them to be, yes, added difficulty, but not added annoyance. That was the important part.
Use it in the middle of my potion bloodlust and 3 seconds left of my snapshot window, completely gimping my damage performance for the next 2 minutes, which is the main reason I am here to begin with. I am all for dungeons being designed so classes can use their utility kits to handle problems, but the way these problems are implemented feel forced and unnatural, causing obligatory friction that a lot of people like to classify as difficulty with a just get good solution. Play Cuphead, guy. Do the Valkyries in God of War on the highest difficulty if you want a skill challenge, and let me do my Deathmark window on my Assassination Rogue in peace. Incorporeal and Afflicted are some of the worst affixes added and the best examples for this. Although boring and gatekeeping, Fortified, Tyrannical, Bursting, Bolstering, Raging are mostly fine.
Yeah,
Still
they just
needs
make it
some look
harder.
at, of course, as all affixes do, but better than the stop healing your party, stop dispelling poisons from your party, and deal with this other non-dungeon thing instead. The spells
Sure.
get ridiculous on bosses like the Throne of the Tides Shaman boss, when you have Afflicted to be dispelled and you are already juggling one dispel on your party for one of the two Flame Shock debuffs, spot healing the other dispel because you don't have two dispels, and a third unexpected dispel pops and nobody in the party can handle it. This limits the composition of groups
Yeah,
that can
that
clear the
sucks.
content in that very moment. Some of these affixes are annoying in low keys, making me feel like I have to stop playing WoW and do them instead. And on higher keys, it makes classes like Evokers mandatory to cover the lack of utility other classes have or don't have, further gatekeeping classes and specs from clearing higher content in a world where we want players to feel like their spec contributes to the value of the group. Overall, affixes are a problem, but for the sake of the video, we will only talk about the complicated part, which ends up as an annoyance and not a fun obstacle to overcome for a 2 in 5
Sure. Yeah.
chances of looting 1 in 9 items at the end of the dungeon if you get it in time.
Right.
For the
Yeah.
most part, specs are getting better and better at being designed and feeling nice to play, but the fact that all specs require guides to play properly is still
I do feel like specs in general are in a pretty good spot right now. Class balance seems to be doing well. Of course, when we make a raid, we're going to get, for the current raid, we're going to get a ton of melee DPS, and that's because people want the legendary right now. That makes sense. But overall, I feel like class balance is pretty good. People have been enjoying their classes. I don't see a lot of people changing classes or saying, "Oh, this class isn't viable anymore." It's they've been doing a good job with class design,
bad. It is a touchy line between death and simple,
especially
since
towards the
not
end of
one
Dragonflight right now.
formula is 100% correct, but there are outliers
Springborn
that take it
Paladins,
too
yeah.
far. Arcane Mage, for example, has a complex rotation that's incredibly pretentious about who you target and how you target, what buttons you press, and how many of them you press. Combat often forces you out of your rotation and nukes your performance. If we're going to have
Jeez.
complex specs, for which I am an advocate, then we have to make them less punished by combat design to the point of people being better off respecking two alternatives.
Yeah, just play fire, then don't play that bullshit arcane. There you go.
Brewmaster, hard to play and rewarding at the same time, which is fine, but the button bloat is too much. A lot of the buttons don't have a lot to do with the spec tanking. You can be testy about every bit of tiny DR you get, but with that logic you can justify adding infinite buttons so long as they give a tiny bit of tankiness. It needs to have impactful buttons that function with the kit without turning the spec into a glorified DPS. I'm talking about you, Jadewind.
Congrats, Ken.
Outlaw Rogue, one of the funnest specs in the game as of today. The burst windows and spammy abilities is what WoW needs a bit more of, but I would be lying to say that this doesn't get exhausting after a while. Not sure how to look at this particular one.
I haven't DPS in a long time. I've been playing Blood DK for like 3 expansions now. But what I will say is when I used to DPS, when I was playing Fire Mage and stuff, those burst windows were fun. They were, and then maintaining, your DPS as best you could until the next burst window came around. They were enjoyable. It was a fun way to DPS. You save everything. You wait for that perfect moment where the boss is somewhat weakened or in a stand state where you're going to be able to stand still and just pop off. The only thing that annoys me about burst windows is people will parse and they won't fucking move anymore because they don't want to ruin their burst window and they'll just die. Yeah, a dead body, you know how much DPS that does? Fucking 0.
The spec, and it is
Thanks.
one of my mains at the moment because it plays the way
I
it
don't
does.
play anything else
but
but
I
Blood
cannot
DK.
help but acknowledge that mechanically not everyone can play Outlaw, and maybe that's okay. We should have specs that even button mashers like me can enjoy, while Assassination is a nicer, slower counterpart for rogue lovers that don't want carpal tunnel. But at that point, Assassination needs to be close to evenly balanced so people don't feel forced to play Outlaw, which unfortunately isn't the case, so people do feel forced to play Outlaw, a spec that some of us cannot actually play. And these specs aside, we have too many buffs and procs
yeah, I don't
across
even
the
know what
board.
the hell half this shit
It
is
gets
anymore.
hard to keep track of everything that happens with your spec when there aren't enough rows to display your buffs. This gets translated into combat when you have 100 damage events from hits of a few hundred damage each to crits
Jeez,
of
hey, look at this guy's screen. You can't tell me this shit doesn't have real life applicability. Like sometimes I used to tell my parents, I'd be like, guys, WoW makes you better at life. Well, whether you're a raid leader and it teaches you how to become a leader or something, or something like this where it's teaching you how to pay attention to multiple things at the same time. Look at this shit. This guy could become a heart surgeon. Look, he can monitor his patient's heart rate while operating, while maintaining the room and understanding what's going on in there. This guy's ready. He can go to medical school after all this shit. Look at that.
Of
Multitasking for sure, yeah.
700k. It doesn't make sense numbers-wise for my
Made you a
character
better
to
driver.
do 200k
Shit.
DPS, but still have
What
hits
up,
of
Leaky?
3,000
Noisy.
or less. What even are numbers at this point? Trinkets, files, weapons all have minor damage procs. Every spec deals a gazillion little damage events that fill the screen with numbers. This makes numbers pointless, makes the screen busy and exhausting to look at. One of the big reasons people prefer Classic, I would imagine, is big
Smaller
hits when you
numbers.
press big buttons.
Yeah.
Simple. The best example for this is Balance Druid, which has damage ticks from Moonfire, damage ticks from Sunfire, damage ticks from Astral Smolder, damage
probably
ticks
looks
from
wild.
Shooting Stars, damage ticks from Starfall, damage ticks from Mushrooms,
turn the numbers
damage
off,
ticks
yeah.
from Stellar Flare, if talented.
I know, yeah, really. It would just turn the numbers off then. Look, I mean, smaller numbers are easier to understand. It is nicer when things are like, oh yeah, a 1K crit is a big deal. I mean, right now you're talking 30s, 400K hits and shit like that. Yeah, people need to, the number bloating happens. It's natural, and eventually they'll probably bring it back down. I think the last time they brought it down was when. Was it BFA? Did they do a number squish in BFA? I know the first time was like WAD. Yeah, BFA. I think so. That's right. And they'll do it again. They'll do it again. But it's a problem that's always going to come back no matter what.
Damage sticks
It
from
doesn't bother me that
Starfire
much.
Cleave. Sometimes damage sticks from tier sets. Damage sticks from trinkets or embellishments. Damage sticks
Yeah.
from Fury of Valud.
Legion numbers got out of
On
hand.
one hand, it's nice to have many ways of dealing damage and many cool buttons to press. But on another hand, I have no idea what any of the numbers on my screen mean, so what's the purpose of even having numbers on screen then? At that point, if the question has to be asked, then there is a flaw in the system. On top of this, all specs require simming and high dedication to research in order to play optimally, and it isn't great.
Sure.
Although sometimes it can be fun, but only to some extent. While it's always a good thing to have super players, the gap today between an average player and a super player is way too big, and this is purely how the specs /spells /talents /gears are built and all the multiple interactions between them.
Yeah,
Even
I
the
mean, look, I get this, but the thing is, this is not really a Blizzard problem. This is a societal problem. This is like these tools were not available in vanilla. This shit didn't exist yet. But if it did, trust me, people would have used it. And it wouldn't have made the game any different in terms of what Blizzard had created, but it would make the game different in terms of how people play the game. So, I mean, I don't know what Blizzard can do about this. People are always going to parse. People are always going to figure out what the hell is the best. They're always going to figure out best in slot gear. That's just going to happen. That's just part of how games are played today.
simplest spec cannot be at its best without the use of external tools and websites. The fact that we need weak and add-ons in order to play some specs or be able to go through some raid fights or dungeons is just bad. Add-ons and
Gone are
weak-
the days where you just wait for your Game Informer to show up in your mailbox because you sold some games to GameStop and they gave you a free subscription for a year. Yeah, that shit don't happen anymore. Now everyone has the internet and everyone just goes on there and does their research. If they
should
care
be
enough to do it.
optional and the quality of life improvement, not required to play.
People always optimize
I was
the fun
talking
out of
to
a game.
Marcellian the other day, and he remembers being pissed that the game became so easy back in WoD. But now, looking back, he had more fun playing it. And it always comes back to the first thing you interact with, your class. Encounters, balancing, comps, and PvP play a big role, and again, it's nice having the space for optimizing and geeking on being a master at your class, but it has to have some limits because I feel today it's just out of control. Blizz needs to take a look at the level of complexity they have in the game and tone it down 10-20%, maintaining a smaller space for optimization but lowering the barrier of entry for decent performance, feedback on what you're pressing. And when you are fine just looking to have some fun in the game, we made a video on the most fun range DPS specs you can check right
Sure.
here if you click it on your screen right now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what he said, except kind of like the parsing stuff. There's nothing Blizzard can do about that. People are going to optimize. There's games out there. I mean, I could imagine that people will fucking optimize Pal World. You know, if I can, like, Pokemon Simulator game. It's just how it is today. No matter how uncomplicated or complicated a game will be, people are going to optimize it because that's just how society works today. Other than that, I'm slightly worried about hero specs. He didn't really talk about them because I think this video might be a little bit older. He is wearing a Christmas
Smaller
sweater,
space for
you know, in the end of it. So you might have not known about those yet, but hero talents could, you know, add extra bloat. I'm worried they keep iterating on that system. Maybe it becomes more and more bloated. And then we're talking about like a 3-spec system now, where you got your core, you've got your specialized part of the spec. You know, you already have 2 trees, and then you got this 3rd tree now that starts to become a bigger tree. I wouldn't want that. So hopefully they figure out a way to balance that shit out.